Alf Swaggle shouted us out, but kind of took a swipe at us, and then didn't realize that he was actually helping make my points for me. We will dive in and react to Swaggle video, Nothing is Rare in Comic Books. That's news. Be right back. Hello to all my collectibles friends. We are back again. It's another day. It's another collectibles video. I hope that everyone is having an amazing week so far. If you do like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We just crossed over 1,000 subscribers not that long ago, and I'm right at like 3,900 watch hours. So we are this close to being monetized here on Collectibles Dad. We are going to talk today, react to a video that I had made, a few videos I have made around supply. Swaggle made a video here recently that was kind of responding to it. I make a lot of supply type videos where it's like, hey, look out, graded supply is going to go up, and I'm not so sure the prices are going to hold up. I've been really driving that home because I think it's something that really nobody in the comic universe talks about very much on YouTube. There's a lot of happy, all that stuff, and it's jump onto my claim sale, or it's top 10 selling books or whatever. But the one thing that I don't really hear a lot about is, it does feel like there is a lot of supply, and maybe possibly that extra supply could be a vulnerability for price points moving forward. Now, why are we having this conversation? Let's actually listen to what Swaggle had to say. To be fair, let's go ahead and play what he said so that we can respond to it. He made reference to my other channel, Sports Card Dad, where he feels I might have kind of like a sports card brain, where maybe I wouldn't be able to understand the difference between the two hobbies. But I've actually been also collecting comic books since 2018, so I'm not brand new to the comic book space, but let's hear it. Roll it, Frank! That's your cue. Now. Idiot.
Shout out to Dustin, Collectibles Dad. He's been talking a lot about how, all roads are sort of leading to every comic book being graded and how that's going to tank the market. I can kind of understand what he's getting at if that's his thesis, although I think his argumentation is a little bit flawed because, in my opinion, he's kind of coming at it from a sports card lens.
I think we're late again.
Which is to say that, a lot of times in sports cards, people are willing to pay, say, hundreds of dollars for a PSA 10, where they're only willing to pay, like $3 for the raw card.
What?
Comic books, it's not really the same. Even when we see a picture like this and we see a lot of ASM 129s and we think to ourselves like, oh my God, look at how many raw comics there are right there.
We got a 1987 Fleer! Factory set.
I mean, that's going to flood the census. That's going to flood the market. It's like, yes, that is true. And that could have some implication on the price. But at the same time, when have you ever seen someone sell an ASM 129 not near its graded fair market value? I mean, that's really the difference right there, is that if you have say an AF15, it's a low grade, maybe it would grade out to be a 2.0. I mean, nobody is going to sell that to you for half price. Everyone is still going to list that raw copy at $20,000 or whatever the fair market value is. I mean, maybe you can get a little bit of a deal on it. Maybe there is some grading gap. In fact, I did that video the other week talking about the grading gap on certain books. But even in those instances, I mean, even in the most drastic situations, the grading gap is, say, maybe 2x, maybe half of the price. So I don't necessarily think that this is, sort of in the place where sports cards are absolutely going to tank the market when everything kind of gets graded. I think that for the most part, people are still selling these books at the going rate, almost near, their fair market value. And again, I think that that's where I'll sort of tie this entire video together, where even though no comic is rare and you see picks like this that have, a bunch of 129s on the table, doesn't necessarily mean that the books are worthless. I mean, again, it's all supply and demand, so as long as there is demand there for the comic books, then the going rate is going to be the going rate. And yes, there's a lot of market manipulation going on. I mean, people hoard this stuff, as, we are demonstrating with this picture right here, or even with Anna Loves. She could absolutely tank the market. If she decided to sell all of her Crime 22s today, I mean, that would absolutely have implications on the fair market value, at least, if they all went on sale in that particular auction. But that's also kind of the point. I mean, it doesn't matter if she has 10,000 copies. If she's unwilling to sell it to you for less than the going rate, then you're going to have to pony up and pay what she asked for. Similarly with, anyone who has an ASM 129. I mean, just because there's 20,000 copies out there, doesn't mean that it's a $20 key. It's just the going rate is the going rate, supply and demand. Now, of course, there could be a time in the future where nobody wants this book anymore, nobody collects comic books, and yeah, everything will definitely go to zero then. But until then, there's still, of course, going to be some value.
All right, so let's talk about the first point that he makes. And he said, hey, someone on the sports card side might pay $3 for a raw card, but then if it's in a PSA 10 holder, maybe it's hundreds of dollars, is what he said. We played it. Now, that might have been true in 2020 or 2021 during the boom, but man, that's a really tough one to pull off nowadays and really over the last 2 years. Buying a $3 to $5 sports card and a PSA 10 turns that thing into hundreds of dollars. I mean, it would have to be a vintage card. It would not be a modern or an ultra modern card unless someone accidentally sells it for $3 to $5. There's just not that sort of arbitrage in sports cards as it sits now. You would have to get an old vintage card for $3 to $5 and it gets a PSA 10. And maybe you can sell it for hundreds. It's possible. But the idea that you're going to get a 50s baseball card of a star and, it's going to go great at PSA 10 and maybe that turns into hundreds or $1,000. I mean, it would be extremely, extremely rare for that to happen. It's actually similar in sports cards. I'll use an example here, the 57 Topps Bart Starr rookie card. This is in a 4, an SGC 4. Now, this card in the very similar condition, not sitting in this holder, it actually would go for a similar amount. And that's kind of the point that Swags is making in his video is, hey, look, if you have a key comic book, whether it's sitting in a graded holder or if it's ungraded, if it's raw, it will still go for a comparable price. It's still a comparable price point if it's in nice condition. And that's fine. And I think really, if we're talking about the main difference between the two hobbies right now, the big one, the big one, actually there's two. There's two main differences. The biggest one to me is that grading, third-party grading, is about 10 years behind sports cards. The idea of grading sports cards is older than what it is for comic books. Not much older, but it's still older and it's more mature, it's more defined. GC graded more comics in the last 5 years than they did probably in the 10-15 previous to that, thanks to the big boom, thanks to the 40-somethings like myself getting back into collectibles, all the nostalgia, all the goodness, and also all the speculation. Hey, we're 40, we got some money, and we're speculating on comic books because stocks, bonds, real estate, it's okay, and of course it's safe-ish, but this is way more fun. We have a lot more speculation money that's flowed into collectibles. Everybody knows this, going back to really pre-2020. This happened, I remember in 2018 when I got back into comic books, there was still some pretty good movement on prices based on spec, movies and shows, etc. Mainly movies back then in 2018. So this is not a brand new thing. It's not a thing that the pandemic just brought on. It's just the pandemic saw it supercharged. But I guess my main point here is that in the same fashion as an old comic book, the sports cards do operate the same way, but a lot of times you have more buyer confidence, just like on the comic book side, if you have it in a graded holder. I don't buy vintage sports cards raw, ungraded, unless I am with somebody that has an eye for it, an amazing eye for it, that's been collecting it for decades. Because there's fake cards out there. There's BS. There's touched up cards, restored cards, fake cards, etc. The same way you could buy an ungraded comic book and it's missing page 28 and they touched up a little bit on the inside cover. Touched it up a little bit and they kind of trimmed aside. I mean, look, if you don't have an eye for it, which I would argue the vast majority of card collectors / speculators do not have an eye for it, then the move is to go graded. So I am predicting an expansion of comic book grading over the next 5-10 years, not a contraction. I don't think it's going to contract. I think it's just going to expand. I think people that are putting some serious money into collectibles are going to want them to be authenticated, to be graded, whatever. I think there's going to be an expansion of competition, and not just the comic book grading space, in trading cards and Funkos and all the other stuff. I think that there's going to be increased competition because there's going to be demand for graded collectibles, more so than there is today in comic books. I keep hearing, I don't know what's going on. I actually hear people that are thinking that there's going to be a movement towards ungraded comic books. I couldn't disagree more. I could not disagree more. There might be long-time collectors that, just don't believe in third-party grading. I totally get it, respect it. You're allowed to think however you want. You're allowed to have that opinion. But I am of the belief that consumer sentiment is going to be wrapped around third-party grading, and the demand for third-party grading, the same way that it is in trading cards, is going to continue to accelerate in comic books and other collectibles. Which brings us to the next point, population reports for graded comic books. So that supply is rising. It's rising dramatically. In his video, Swaggle actually shows a few different examples of collectors, hoarders that are hoarding many, many copies of this stuff. And that scares the hell out of me, because what's going to happen is eventually they're going to sell, or eventually they're going to grade it. It's a huge vulnerability when I see somebody that's got 40 or 50 copies of ASM 129 First Appearance of Punisher, a lot of them graded. And then there's probably a dozen that were sitting there that were ungraded. And we know that. We know there's a lot of ungraded copies of key books. What happens if that individual or those individuals decide, you know what? We're going to sell off half of this now. And all that supply hits the market. You don't think that's going to have an effect on prices? You think that demand is going to eat that up and continue to keep the prices where they are or rise? I mean, you just showed me basically that we have a lot of holders of stuff, which you could argue, okay, hey, there's a great collector base, collector/hoarder base in comic books, but eventually it's going to come to market. It will come. It's just a matter of time for all of us, my stuff too. Eventually it all comes to market. All the people out there that are buying out collections, what do you see? I mean, every day there's post after post. Got this today, found this key, found this first appearance of Thor, it's heading off to CGC, found this, that, found this, it's heading off to CGC. That's how it's all gonna go. It's not gonna be a movement to raw ungraded. It's not gonna happen like that. And again, we're talking about key books. Is every comic book worth grading? No, it's not. Obviously not. There's a ton of limited edition this or that or whatever. Going back to the 90s when I was collecting books, going back to late 80s, 90s, how many limited edition whatevers, polybags, could they have possibly made? There's not everything is worth grading. I'm talking about the key books, but those are the vulnerable books because there is a ton of not just supply, but ungraded supply still to be graded. And Swags throws out the example of AF-15, which is kind of it's like the extreme, and makes the point of, oh, well, this is not going to go to zero. Says like, oh, this stuff's not going to go to zero. Nobody said it's going to zero. Nobody said that ungraded copies of AF-15 are going to be $10. Of course, those are going to demand a high premium. The same way that a 52 tops mantle, if we're throwing out extremes, 52 tops mantle is still going to be very expensive if it's ungraded. And then let's touch on his main point of, hey, look, we all know that this stuff is not rare. We all know that? Do all the speculators know that? Because I've been watching YouTube videos for years going back now on the comic book side where it's get this book now, get it before it's too late. There has been a lot of talk of limited supply out there, but I don't hear anybody talking about the supply. So the whole idea that everybody knows that the stuff is not rare, I wouldn't say the average collector knows that an AF-15 might not be super rare. I actually know pretty seasoned collectors that bought Hulk 181 at a high price, that bought Amazing Spider-Man 300.98 at a very high price. Seasoned collectors that just FOMO'd in like we all do. I FOMO'd into stuff too. But the idea that everybody knew or everybody knows that this stuff is not rare, I would argue that's not true because actions speak louder than words, and people are out, they've spent a lot of money, they've spent big money on these books with the assumption probably this is a big book. This is, there's only 100 on the census. There's 500 on the census. Let's go back a few years. Maybe there's 28 on the census, and now there's 1,500 or whatever. So if we're going to track pricing and we're going to look at price movement, supply, and especially the graded supply, is the other half of that equation. And we all know in collectibles, the big killer on price is the thing rare or is it not rare? And if it's not rare, then it's just a matter of time before, oh, wait, people are spending big money on this thing, whatever this collectible thing is, they all rush to find it. And that's what's happening. That's what we've seen over the last few years. Everyone's going to find it. And we got dudes out here with 50 ASM 129s. I mean, that isn't worrisome to anybody else. So again, nobody said that key comics like AF-15, for crying out loud, were going to zero. Of course not. But I'll push back on the point of everybody knows this stuff isn't rare or everybody knew that. I would argue against that. because the actions speak louder than the words over the last few years. That's why I will continue to wait. I will continue to hold. I want to see what happens with Amazing Spider-Man #1. I want to watch that census. I'm not buying a 9.0 of Amazing Spider-Man #1. The copy I'm going to buy is probably going to be in the $5,000 to $7,000 range. But what's my rush when they continue to rise? Actually, some independent data that was sent to me, they projected based on kind of trends and how stuff has been moving, not a perfect science, that the ASM1 census for graded copies for ASM1 will increase approximately, if it kind of stays on this trajectory, about 20% over the next 5 years. That's a significant number. This isn't an argument against demand for these books. Hulk 1, AF-15, Amazing Spider-Man 1, there will always be demand for these books, but it's all relative, and it's also relative to the actual supply that's available and then the actual supply that's on the market at any given time. So please, my God, hope that these people with these books that have got big books where they got 100 copies of it, hope that they hold, hope that there's not 100 copies that hit the market at the same time, because then you'll have some really fun charts to talk about on the video. All right, my friends, that's all that I've got. Stay healthy, stay awesome, and I will talk to you again later.